A black boy didn't hesitate to pay for a man's coffee, unaware that the man was a billionaire. Feeling touched by the kind and honest heart, Billionaire observed the life and entered the house of the poor boy. Here, the billionaire not only saw the image of himself in the past, but also discovered a shocking truth. The boy's grandmother was the benefactor, the one who had changed his life. Now, when he had the opportunity to repay a debt he would never forget, he would help them just as the grandmother had given him a chance before. New Orleans, once alive with jazz and endless energy, now bore the quiet weight of time. The setting sun cast golden streaks across the cracked pavement, the neon signs of old diners flickering weakly, as if fighting against the city's slow decay. The streets bustled, but beneath the movement lay a tired rhythm, one built on survival. Alexander Carter, a man of wealth and stature, walked at an unhurried pace, his polished shoes clicking against the uneven sidewalk. 40 years old, dressed in a tailored suit, the picture of success, but something about this place still pulled at him. He hadn't been back in years, yet every street corner, every faded mural, whispered memories he hadn't thought about in a long time. Stopping in front of a small, run-down coffee stand, he hesitated. It looked different from how he remembered it, but the smell was the same, strong, rich, carrying a hint of burnt caramel. Without much thought, he stepped forward. Black coffee, he ordered, reaching into his pocket for his wallet only to find nothing. His fingers patted down his inside pocket, his coat, then his pants. Empty. A flicker of frustration crossed his face. He had left his wallet in the car. The barista, a tired-looking man in his 50s, raised a brow. "That'll be $2, man." Alexander exhaled through his nose, forcing a tight smile. "Right. Looks like I left my wallet." The barista's expression immediately shifted. His polite indifference was replaced with something sharper, meaner. "No money, no coffee. I can just run back and grab it." "Sure," the man scoffed. "That's what they all say. Guy in a fancy suit but can't even pay for a coffee." "Yeah, I'm not running a charity here." He slid the coffee back, making a show of reaching for the trash can. Alexander's jaw clenched, embarrassment creeping up his spine. He wasn't used to this. He could buy the entire damn coffee stand if he wanted to, and yet, at this moment, he was being treated like a nobody. "Here." A crumpled $2 bill hit the counter. Alexander turned, startled, as a young boy no older than 12 stepped forward. Jamal Williams. Thin frame, oversized hoodie, sneakers that looked like they'd barely survived another day. A kid who had no business paying for someone else's coffee. The barista barely looked at him before swiping the money and shoving the coffee back toward Alexander. At least someone knows how this works. Jamal didn't acknowledge him. His dark eyes stayed locked on Alexander, unreadable. "Now you got your coffee," he said, voice even. "So, are you going to take it or just stand there?" Alexander hesitated before wrapping his fingers around the warm cup. "You didn't have to do that," he said carefully. Jamal shrugged. "Didn't feel like standing here all night." Alexander studied him. "Let me pay you back." Jamal shook his head. "Just pay it forward." The words landed heavier than expected. Alexander had heard them before long ago. He didn't move as Jamal turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Something about the boy, the way he carried himself, the quiet strength in his voice left Alexander standing there longer than he should have. And then, curiosity tugging at the edges of his mind, he followed. Jamal reached the small, weathered house and set the bag of groceries and medicine down by the door. He let out a quiet breath, as if releasing the weight of the day, then sank onto the wooden steps of the porch. The paint on the railing was chipped, the wood beneath him slightly warped, but he didn't seem to mind. He sat there for a moment, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at nothing in particular. Alexander had followed him at a distance, his curiosity no longer just a passing interest, but something deeper, an unshakable need to understand. Stepping forward, he approached the porch, and without invitation, lowered himself onto the step beside Jamal. The boy turned his head slightly, his body tensing for just a second, his gaze sharp and wary. The instinct of someone used to strangers not always being kind. "Do you do all this for someone?" Alexander's voice was even, calm, as if he were speaking to an equal rather than a child. Jamal hesitated before nodding. "My grandma. She's sick. Medicine costs a lot, so I do what I can." His voice was steady, but there was something else underneath it, a quiet determination, a resolve far too strong for someone his age. Alexander studied him for a moment. And all those people you helped today? The woman with the groceries, the shopkeeper, the pharmacist. Jamal lifted his shoulders in a small shrug, his fingers absent-mindedly picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. They needed help, he said simply. Baba always says, just cause you're struggling don't mean you gotta be selfish. If you can help, you should. One day, life will help you back. The words hit Alexander harder than he expected. Something about them felt familiar. The certainty in them, the way they weren't just words but something the boy truly believed. He turned his gaze away, staring out at the dimming sky, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. He hadn't thought about those kinds of words in a long time. Jamal sat quietly beside him, his small frame still, though there was an alertness in the way he held himself. The streetlights flickered on in the distance, their dull yellow glow casting soft shadows on the pavement. Alexander exhaled, slow and measured. You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago, he said, his voice quieter now. Jamal glanced at him, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Who? For the first time in years, Alexander allowed his mind to drift back to a different time, a different version of himself. His fingers tapped absently against his knee as he let the memory take hold. Alexander's gaze drifted beyond the cracked pavement, beyond the dim streetlights, beyond the present moment entirely. His voice, when he spoke again, was softer, almost distant. A long time ago, I was a kid like you, hungry, alone, with nowhere to go. Jamal's eyes flickered with interest, his posture shifting slightly as he listened. I remember the cold more than anything, Alexander continued, his voice carrying the weight of years. I hadn't eaten in days. My hands were shaking. I sat outside a diner, watching people go in and out, hoping maybe someone would leave something behind, a scrap, anything. But nobody did. I was just invisible to them. He paused, his jaw tightening briefly before he exhaled. But then she came. A woman, middle-aged, kind eyes, warm smile. She saw me. Really saw me. She didn't ask any questions, didn't look at me with pity, just walked right inside that diner and bought me a meal. Sat me down. Made sure I ate every bite. I don't think I even said thank you. I was too busy trying not to cry between mouthfuls. Jamal stayed silent, but his fingers curled slightly against the wood of the porch railing. Alexander glanced at him before continuing. She didn't stop there. She asked me where I lived, if I had family. I didn't. Not really. So, she took me somewhere, a shelter, a small community center for kids like me. But she didn't just drop me off and leave. She talked to the people there, made sure they had the resources to help. And when she found out I wanted to go to school but had no way of doing it, she invested in that place, made sure I had what I needed to start. Food, books, a chance. He let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. Before she left, she told me something. She said, if you ever get the chance to help someone, don't think twice. Do it. The world only gets better if we make it better. He shook his head, looking down at his hands. I never saw her again, but I never forgot her. Jamal swallowed, his voice quiet when he finally spoke. You think life helped you back? Alexander turned to look at him then, his expression unreadable for a moment before a small, knowing smile appeared. I think maybe it's my turn to return the favor. Jamal pushed open the door, stepping inside first, the dim light casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Alexander followed, his gaze sweeping across the modest room. It was small, barely furnished, but clean. On the far wall, a few faded photographs hung unevenly, their edges curled with time. In the corner, an old armchair sat beside a table stacked with neatly folded blankets. The faint scent of chamomile tea lingered in the air. On the bed, a frail woman lay propped up by a few thin pillows. Martha Williams, now well into her 70s, had a face lined with years of struggle, yet her dark eyes still held warmth. Her graying hair was neatly braided, and though her body looked weak, there was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself. She turned her head as Jamal entered, a soft smile forming despite the fatigue in her expression. You're home, baby. Was it a hard day? Her voice, though gentle, carried the weight of exhaustion. Jamal set the bag of medicine down on the table, pouring a glass of water before handing it to her. Not too bad, Grandma. Actually, I met someone today." He turned slightly, motioning toward Alexander. Martha's gaze shifted, taking in the tall man standing near the doorway. Her eyes, still sharp despite age, studied him with curiosity but no fear. Alexander stepped forward, lowering himself onto the worn-out chair beside the bed. "It's a pleasure to meet you, ma'am. My name is Alexander." Martha gave a polite nod, but as she looked at him, something flickered across her face, something hesitant, searching, as though a distant memory was trying to surface. Alexander, sensing the moment, allowed his eyes to wander across the room, his voice quieting. "Jamal told me you raised him alone. That must have been difficult." Martha let out a slow breath, her fingers absently smoothing the blanket over her lap. "Difficult, yes, but he's a good boy, strong, kind, just like his father used to be." She paused, as if weighing her words, then her gaze drifted toward the window. "My son, Isaiah," her voice caught for a moment, and she swallowed before continuing. "He was a bright child. Always drawing, always painting. There wasn't a wall in this neighborhood he hadn't left his mark on. He used to say he'd grow up to paint murals all over New Orleans." I believed him. A small, wistful smile touched her lips before fading just as quickly. Her eyes darkened, voice lowering. "But life doesn't always go the way we think it will. He got caught up with the wrong people, started making bad choices. At first I thought it was just a phase, something I could pull him out of. But before I knew it, the drugs had taken him." Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the glass of water, taking a small sip. The room felt heavier, the air thick with unspoken grief. "I tried," she whispered, voice barely above a breath. "God knows I tried. I begged him to stop, put him in programs, got him help. But every time he'd fall back. And one day he told me he couldn't do it anymore, that he didn't want to be my burden. He walked out that door, and I never saw him again." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she wiped it away quickly, as if she had long grown tired of crying over a wound that never healed. "I used to blame myself. Maybe if I had done something different, maybe if I had been stronger, but blaming myself won't bring him back. All I can do now is make sure Jamal doesn't walk down the same road." Jamal, who had been listening in silence, reached out and took her hand. His small fingers curled gently around hers, offering what little comfort he could. For a long moment, Alexander didn't speak. He simply sat there, watching the pain settle in Martha's features, feeling the weight of her words in a way he hadn't expected. Then, slowly, she turned toward the nightstand, reaching out with shaky hands. She pulled open a small drawer, retrieving a worn-out photograph. With careful movements, she placed it on the table between them. "This was my family, back when Isaiah was still my little boy." Alexander picked up the photo, and as his eyes fell upon the image, his breath caught in his throat. The edges of the picture were frayed, the colors faded with time. But there was no mistaking what he saw. A young woman, Martha, much younger, smiling warmly, holding a small child in her arms. A sudden chill ran down his spine, his fingers tightening around the photo. His pulse quickened, memories crashing into him like a flood. He looked up at Martha, his voice barely above a whisper. "You," he swallowed, forcing the lump in his throat down. "You're the woman who saved me." Martha's expression shifted, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What?" Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he placed the photo back on the table. "Years ago I was just a kid, alone, starving, sitting outside a diner. A woman, you saw me. You bought me food, gave me warmth. But you didn't stop there. You found a shelter, made sure they had the funds to keep kids like me off the streets. You told me." His voice broke for a second before he continued. "If you ever get the chance to help someone, don't think twice. The world only gets better if we make it better." Martha blinked, her hands gripping the blanket tighter. She stared at him, searching his face, her mind pulling at long-buried memories. She started, but hesitated. "I've helped many children over the years. I wish I could remember them all, but... Alexander exhaled slowly, nodding in understanding. She had done so much good in her life, how could she possibly remember every face? Then, an idea struck him. He unbuttoned his sleeve, rolling it up to reveal a faint birthmark on his wrist. You once told me this looked like a fingerprint that fate left behind. Said you'd never seen one quite like it. Martha's breath hitched, but she still hesitated. Her eyes widened, but she needed more. Reaching into his wallet, Alexander pulled out something small, something old. A silver coin, slightly tarnished but still intact. He placed it into her hand. You gave me this, he said, voice thick with emotion. Told me that as long as I had it, I'd never be completely without something. That no matter how lost I felt, I'd always have a little bit of hope. Martha's fingers closed around the coin, gripping it so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Tears welled up in her eyes, and suddenly she let out a small, broken gasp. Oh my God! Her voice cracked, and then, as if the years had never passed, as if time had collapsed in on itself, she looked at him with complete recognition. Her face crumpled, and she reached for his hand, gripping it with surprising strength. Alexander, is it really you? His own eyes burned, his voice rough with emotion. It's me, Martha. She let out a soft, shaky sob, her fingers curling tighter around his. Tears spilled freely down her wrinkled cheeks as she laughed between her cries, shaking her head in disbelief. My boy, my sweet boy, look at you. Alexander leaned forward, wrapping his arms around her, and for the first time in decades, he felt like a child again. Like the lost boy who had been saved. Like the world, for all its hardships, had finally come full circle. In the weeks that followed, Alexander kept his promise. Without hesitation, he arranged for Martha to receive the medical care she had long been denied. The hospital bills, the medications, the constant worry that had weighed Jamal down for so long, all of it was lifted. Martha, though frail, began to regain her strength. The color returned to her cheeks, and the persistent ache in her chest that had plagued her for years finally eased. But more than that, she carried something new within her: relief, hope. Every time she looked at Alexander, she saw not just the successful man he had become, but the lost boy she had once saved, and in her heart she knew that kindness had come full circle. Jamal, wide-eyed with disbelief when Alexander first mentioned it, was enrolled in a private school with a scholarship bearing his name. The boy had always been sharp, quick-witted, resourceful, skills that had kept him alive. Now they would serve a different purpose. For the first time in his life he had books that weren't falling apart, pencils that weren't worn down to stubs, teachers who looked at him like he mattered. It felt strange at first, being in classrooms filled with kids who had never known hunger the way he had, but he didn't let it intimidate him. He knew what real struggle was. He had survived it. Now he had the chance to build something more. Still, something lingered. A shadow from the past, a missing piece. Isaiah. Jamal never spoke of his father, but Alexander saw the way his expression tightened at the mention of him, the way Martha's voice turned fragile whenever she recalled the boy he once was. It was a wound left open, an absence that had never fully healed. So Alexander did what he did best: he searched. It took weeks. Connections were pulled, favors were called in. Shelters, hospitals, rehabilitation centers, every lead turned cold, every name on the list a dead end. Until one day, in a clinic on the outskirts of the city, a man barely recognizable as the boy Martha had described was found: Isaiah Williams. He was thinner than he should have been, his eyes sunken from years of struggle, but he was alive. More than that, he was sober. 2 years clean. When Alexander spoke to him, when he told him about Jamal, about Martha, about the home he had left behind, something inside the man cracked. He had spent so long convincing himself that leaving was the only way to save them, never daring to believe there was a way back. But there was. The day Isaiah returned was a quiet one. He stepped through the front door hesitantly, hands clenched into fists, his breath unsteady. Jamal stood frozen at the sight of him, his face unreadable. Martha, sitting in her chair by the window, let out a choked gasp. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then, without warning, Jamal turned and bolted not away, but toward him. He crashed into his father's chest with a force Isaiah hadn't expected, and suddenly, the man who had once walked away from his family found himself holding his son again, his arms wrapped around Jamal like a man grasping onto something he had thought lost forever. He whispered his name over and over, like an apology, like a prayer. And Martha, tears spilling freely, reached out and took Isaiah's hand in hers, squeezing it tight, grounding him. Alexander stood at a distance, watching it all unfold, his own throat tight with emotion. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't be easy. But they had been given another chance. And sometimes that was enough. Months later, as the city moved forward, so did they. Martha, healthier than she had been in years, spent her mornings on the porch, watching the world with a quiet sense of peace. Isaiah found work in the same community center that had once tried to save him, determined to give back in the way he had once refused. And Jamal was different. Stronger, wiser. But he never forgot who he was. One evening Alexander walked past the same street where they had first met. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the pavement. And there, near the same convenience store where Jamal had once wiped down dusty counters for food, a familiar sight caught Alexander's eye. Jamal, now dressed in his school uniform, standing beside a younger boy no older than 8, his clothes too thin for the season, his face tired in a way no child should be. Jamal was speaking to him, handing him something. Food. A small package of medicine. A quiet reassurance. Alexander smiled. The cycle had begun again. And the world, in its own quiet way, had gotten just a little bit better. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.